Resident Evil is a game franchise that really needs no introduction. It's Capcom's best-selling series, even topping giants like Monster Hunter or the even longer-running Street Fighter series of games. A few years back, I decided to finally delve into the horror gaming scene since it was a genre I had somewhat neglected trying up until that point. I started by playing through some of the classics like the Team Silent Silent Hill games and most of the Resident Evil titles, as well as some of the more obscure games like Haunting Grounds and Clock Tower 3, which are also produced by Capcom. But for whatever reason, despite experiencing some of the very best the genre had to offer, I had never played the first Resident Evil game where it all began, until now that is. Today, we'll be taking a look back at the roots of horror gaming through the modern lens of 2025 with Resident Evil to see just how well it's held up since its release. Now, before getting into the game, there has been many versions of the 1996 original release, but most fans agree that the 2002 GameCube remake is the best option both visually and in the quality of life department. Throughout the years on the internet, there's been a lot of say and discourse surrounding the roots of where horror games truly began. Some say the genre's roots dates all the way back to 1972 with Haunted House on the Magnavox Odyssey, but in my opinion that's the equivalent of calling Scooby-Doo a horror show. There's just no way anyone found this remotely scary even back then. There was also licensed games back on the NES, but once again this is not scaring anyone and isn't really a horror game since it's converting a movie into a game instead of being something original. However, there is an argument to be made on this next example. Another game to release just a year before Resident Evil is the original Clock Tower, which came out on the same system. In some regards, you could call this the roots of horror gaming, but unfortunately it never came out in the West back then, with it only just making its way overseas last year for the first time with a modern remaster and localization. What I'm trying to say with all this is that Resident Evil was the true beginning of what we know as horror when it comes to gaming now in the modern day. Getting into the game, we are first given the option between our two protagonists, Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield. Each character has slight differences in playstyles, such as Jill starting with a lockpick and 2 extra inventory slots, whereas Chris has more health and starts with the lighter item. I decided to go with Jill for my playthrough since her design in this game is iconic, appearing in spin-off titles, and is who I typically associate with the first game. After selecting the average difficulty, we are treated to a cutscene in the woods. Hearing a distress signal from another police force, you investigate the strange happenings among 4 other STARS members, which are a group of elite police officers for Raccoon City. There's not much time to investigate however, since you're quickly chased off by a zombie dog, which leads you to taking shelter into a nearby mansion. Whoops, wrong footage. Anyway, after finally getting your bearings, it turns out that you've been separated between 2 of your members, and it's here where you're given control for the first time. It doesn't take long as the player to come to terms with the controls and how to progress, which is to scour this mansion, unearthing every nook and cranny alongside investigating different items to find keys or resources to help you progress further and tackle the many threats along the way. No self-respecting Resident Evil video will be complete without mentioning the first encounter you have with a zombie. The dramatic head tone as it reveals itself alongside you immediately being dropped into gameplay still today is an incredibly effective way of bringing the player into this horrifying world and reminding them that they are in control of how they handle it. You could try shooting at it, maybe just running away or just not understand what you're supposed to do and die. The magic of this first encounter is really in how you as the player are allowed to choose whether to fight or flee. Enemies don't drop anything and you are forced to only rely on the limited resources you find, really putting the survival in survival horror, so running is always a valid strategy here. If you don't kill them properly however, they will revive, which is what the gasoline item is for with you burning them. Now I know where the evil within got that idea from. With it releasing when it did back in '96, it came out during the most experimental moment in gaming with the 3D era, and it's surprising how much they got right the first time, with it being a bit of a risk back then when you consider there was nothing else like it at the time. Zombies are such an outdated trope at this point, but the fact that this game usually has one on screen at any given time really creates for a unique dynamic. It's not about merely shredding through them as much as it's about getting from point A to B as carefully as you can. I especially liked how during certain moments of backtracking you'll be surprised by one when you're at your most vulnerable. I love when horror games play around with its backtracking when it's designed to shake things up and mess with your expectations. It's something that really enhances horror and can only be done through the interactive media of video games. I decided to go for the tank controls since I find when a game is designed around them they can really add to the overall experience. There's something about not being able to turn on a dime that really just adds to the feeling of having to outmaneuver an enemy, and coupled with these incredible pre-rendered backgrounds and fixed perspectives, it really felt like the only way to play. Speaking of, the fixed camera, whilst not being the standard today, really sets this game apart when looking at it nowadays. Sure, it might seem a little disorientating, especially when looking at a map or heading in one direction only to be heading in another, but it really feels like a director decided on every shot that you move between, and these backgrounds really tell a story of who used to live here, really adding to the personality of this game. The mansion feels like its own character because of this. The lack of any UI on screen coupled with all this really gives this game a strong visual presence. Nothing feels cluttered, and it's one of those aspects that goes unnoticed when done well but is appreciated nonetheless. As you explore, you'll be helped out by your fellow STARS member Barrett as you slowly piece together what started this whole zombie outbreak to begin with. I've not talked much about the original game, but it's known for its pretty amusing English dub.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.
The remake has a much more fitting tonal direction for its dub, which whilst not as funny, it fits more with the original vision of the game and feels intentional.
That was a close one. A second late, you would have fit nicely into a sandwich.
Really? Thanks. But Barry, didn't you say you were going back to the dining room to find other clues?
The creators have gone on record with the 2002 remake saying how it was their original vision for the game that's free from the hardware limitations of the PlayStation 1 back in 1996. I don't know what they put into this game, but similar to something like the Wind Waker, it's not aged at all when looking at the game today. Character models and the already mentioned background still look spot on. The only difference with the remaster is the upscale resolution, making some of the FMVs look muddy alongside the added widescreen support. I will say though, my only complaint with the PlayStation 4 port are these immersion breaking loading times whenever you die and are booted back to the menu, which has to load each time when selecting a file. This is just a small complaint at the end of the day, but when a game is this immersive, it just stands out like a sore thumb. Back to the gameplay, one aspect of Resident Evil that the game gets right and would have fallen flat without it is how backtracking is treated. We've already looked at how enemies change throughout the course of the story in sections, but the map here itself is worth bringing up. It's so straightforward and easy to understand even for a casual. Red means unexplored areas and green means you found every item in that room. Without this one simple design here, backtracking would have been a total nightmare, but thanks to it you are never truly lost since you have an idea of where to go next at all times without being told directly by the game. Puzzles are also straightforward to understand, usually just being confined to the room you're in. At no point did I need a guide, which is something I find really breaks immersion with these kinds of games. Early horror titles are known for having some obtuse puzzles that frustrate the player, so it's once again an aspect this game gets incredibly right. Now, to touch on the difficulty of Resident Evil, all survival horror games have a similar idea, where as long as you're wise with resources, you'll always be in the right spot when it comes to the game's difficulty. Some enemies pose a threat, such as the infamous zombie dogs being hard to hit and equally just as hard hitting. Nothing felt overwhelming, though I did die a lot in my run since I usually prefer to just run past enemies. The true difficulty of this game comes from managing your inventory, which if not done correctly can lead to many moments of backtracking and frustration. The way you save your game is also limited in the form of these inks that you use on typewriters. I have some very mixed feelings on this idea. On one hand, carefully considering when to save and having moments like in my playthrough where I had to Hail Mary a part in the game due to ruin out stages felt very exciting in the moment, but upon a death and having to reset a decent chunk of the game, it ends up feeling incredibly tedious. I can definitely tell why they got rid of this idea later on, but strange stuff like this is what makes going back to older games so interesting. These rooms are the definition of safe, and especially when you have to make a mad dash for them, not knowing if you'll make it really creates for some powerful atmosphere that is equally horrifying in the moment. Also, I have to mention the part in this game where they mess with your idea of these rooms by having an enemy encounter in them. This is a brilliant way of subverting expectations. The way it catches you off guard after saving and making your way back really had me in the moment. Some notes on the level design. I was surprised with just how much further this game goes. Not only do you explore the mansion and its outside, there's also a residence nearby alongside a scientific research facility. Some areas have some striking visuals like the sharks that you have to avoid. They seem out of place at first, but I loved how the creators mess around with you draining the water and wonder whether or not they're still alive. This makes for some good horror and a pretty freaky way to die in this one moment. Some miscellaneous points, but the door animations back in '96 was a pretty genius way to match load times. Despite them happening a lot throughout the game's runtime, they're a great way to add some suspense and allows the player to take a moment to breathe after witnessing the horrors of this mansion. Also, as someone who grew up playing Luigi's Mansion on the GameCube, it's just really cool seeing where they got the idea from. Similar to that game, the mansion is the most memorable part. It's kind of wild how an incredible game like this can influence a company as big as Nintendo to want to try the idea themselves in their own way. Once again, this shows just how big of an impact this game was back when it first came out, not only to horror but to gaming itself. The small cast of characters in this game are all very memorable. Julie in particular is really cool here, always keeping her wits about. I'm kinda used to horror protagonists freaking out over encounters and just being afraid of their environment, which whilst relatable, this more stoic and unfazed protagonist is a breath of fresh air for this kind of setting. There's also Barry, who has a tragic past you discover during your investigation into the mansion, and he even double crosses you, but you're given the option to help him later on. This game has a few moments where you have to make decisions that affect the story, such as you finding your other member Chris, who is locked up, and you have to find 3 optional keys to save him. This can add some replay value alongside playing as the other protagonist, which a lot of games back in the 90s were really good at implementing. Before getting into the finale for Resident Evil 1, I first wanted to mention just what makes a good horror game. We've already established how well Resident Evil achieves this, but if I could sum up in my own words what makes a good horror game, the key word will be vulnerability. I'm referring to both narrative and gameplay with this idea. Whether it's reconciling with the main character's past trauma with his wife, or in the physical sense having you be completely helpless being left to hide away with no weapons. Horror is really unique in how it has this connection between the player and who you're playing as. To me, the perfect horror game is a blend of this. Whilst Resident Evil doesn't exactly have a strong, more psychological and personal narrative, what's here is entertaining enough as you uncover Umbrella's experiments. I'm fine with it leaning more into the mainstream action survival side, since at the end of the day it's just another flavour of horror. I just find that the games that the original Resident Evil influenced did well to establish more varieties of horror, which unfortunately aren't seen elaborated much in the modern day. Without Resident Evil and its influence, gaming would be very different today, not just on the horror side of things with titles like Silent Hill and Haunting Grounds, but also with beloved classics like Luigi's Mansion. Anyway, wrapping things up, I'd like to talk about the boss fights. They're nothing too crazy and take next to no hits before going down. I get the idea from this that the designs were maybe worried and accounted for how much ammo players would have at these points, but as someone who was playing on the standard difficulty, I always felt like I had more than I needed. But once again, taking off the modern day retrospective lens for a moment, it's obvious that games like this weren't really a thing back then, so it makes sense to be more safer with the challenge, with it being for newcomers alongside the new genre. I will say though, the finale having a self-destruct sequence go down only to finally be able to save Chris on your way to the surface with the countdown going off is incredible. You know the big bad had to show up one more time here. Fortunately, it's incredibly easy taking him out whilst Barry tanks the hits. You use what will become the iconic rocket launcher to take it out and reach the helicopter just in time. And that's Resident Evil 1 from the eyes of a newcomer. This whole experience most certainly still holds up today. I wanted to make this review style video not only to look at this beloved classic from a modern perspective, but also to somewhat address the modern state of horror. As someone who loves this genre in gaming and thinks that at their finest they can be some of the greatest and most thought-provoking journeys out there, I feel like today experiences like this are missing. Without going beyond the scope of this video, Resident Evil really kickstarted the golden era of horror, which died out during the 7th gen with the jump to more action heavy games. Horror games nowadays are very different to what they were back then, even Resident Evil itself. It's not all negative though. I do think some recent titles have been standouts and have really experimented with out there ideas. But I am hoping that when Resident Evil 9 comes along that it brings back a lot from what many will consider the golden era for the genre and becomes another influence. Thanks so much for watching to the end of this video. Do you have any memories of this beloved title? Let me know in the comment section. Also, any feedback on this video will be appreciated. Thanks for watching and have a nice rest of your day.